Now, I know it's already 12, almost 12 noon, but I hope you can still stay for the next part of our program as we move on to the launching and presentation of new material developed by the UPLB Museum of Natural History and its partners. First off is the launching of the Quincentennial Commemoration virtual exhibit. This virtual exhibit is the product of the series of webinars hosted by the UPLB Museum of Natural History to celebrate the Philippines' 500 years of natural history. Let me call on Ms. Harlene May M. Viesca of the UPLB Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Extension, who served as the Project Development Assistant of the UPLB Museum of Natural History for this project, to give a short description of the project itself. Ms. Harlene?
Thank you for the introduction, ma'am. Let me first share my screen. Can you see the preview of our virtual exhibit clearly?
Yes.
So, Sir Floor also placed on here on our chat box the link to the exhibit, which is accessible at the MNH website when you click the tab on MNH in VR. So again, a pleasant morning to everyone and welcome to Baliktanaw, Kasaysayan at Kalikasan, the Quincentennial Commemoration virtual exhibit of the Museum of Natural History here at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Before we start with this short preview of our virtual exhibit, let us first familiarize ourselves with the tools that can help us in navigating through this virtual exhibit. So here we have provided an option for an automated tour, and you can find the buttons here at the lower part of the screen. So there are several guide points to assist you and to narrate to you the different sections of this exhibit, and so that you can hear or read the overview of the topics that were discussed in the 10th part webinar series that ran from May to September this year. You can also open the bottom right button to open the chat section, and you can communicate with other visitors. You can also click on this button here on the lower left to open the map, and clicking anywhere on this map or floor plan will automatically take you to that specific portion in the virtual exhibit. And of course, if you are done with the automated tour, you can still freely explore the virtual exhibit by holding your mouse if you're viewing from your desktop or your laptop to move the camera like so. And you can also use your arrow keys to step forward, backward, sideward, and to swing your vision or view from left to right. Later on, you may also click on the pieces of artwork to view the description, additional information, and the references, since these are excerpts from the webinar of our Baliktanaw. So let's start with the short review. Again, welcome to Baliktanaw, Kasaysayan at Kalikasan. And for a brief background, as established by the Executive Order Number 103, the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines provides a Filipino-centric point of view of the first circumnavigation of the world, underscoring the magnanimity, compassion, and humanity of our ancestors in helping the starving crew of the first circumnavigators, the Armada de Maluco or the Magellan Elcano expedition that traversed the Pacific Ocean, and the courage and bravery of the warriors in Mactan that inspired the heroes and martyrs who founded the Filipino nation and the generations thereafter. And UP joins the nation by holding a year-long commemoration with the theme Gahom sa Buot, Tindig at Pamana ng Bayan, that seeks to highlight perspectives on the conquista from the lens on how we as a people understand our shared past and advance a holistic and inclusive history of the nation. And here in UPLB, we have ang Pilipinas sa loob ng 5 siglo, a series of online and virtually delivered events that aims to highlight the timeline of natural history as a field of science and study in the Philippines. With the sub-theme Baliktanaw, Kasaysayan at Kalikasan, the series helps the public internalize the importance of significant historical events which have ultimately shaped the Philippines' environment and natural wealth. So this is not only a commemoration but also a celebration as we showcase the rare beauty and uniqueness of the Philippines in terms of its wonderful species, which are mostly one of its kind, and of course the key figures who have contributed to what we are able to know in the field of natural history. You may click on this piece to watch the recording of the online launching of PPLB's activities for the Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines, which is directly available at the UPLB MNH YouTube channel. So we are opening this tour or virtual exhibit like how the first circumnavigation of the world began, and it is through the Earth's ocean. So Dr. Lorety David, the director of the Marine Science Institute, gave us the webinar Adobo at Iba Pa, how the science or how the oceans shape our culture. And in this section, you will see a couple of artifacts that tell you how their ships rode the ocean waves to reach Asia. The models presented by Dr. David during the webinar also gives us an idea of the situation back then. For instance, how did they experience El Nino or La Nina when they were traveling? Was there a high tide or a low tide in Mactan? And how did these natural occurrences in the ocean and in the environment help in the victory of Lapu-Lapu and his troops? And of course, even the exchanges of resources, practices, and culture that was made possible by the oceans. You're also provided with a display case like this one, which you can click to know more about our speaker and to watch their webinar. And speaking of shaping culture, a part of the Philippine cuisine also plays a crucial role, and it is the practice of fermenting food through the action of microorganisms. So Dr. Noel Sabina is MNH's curator for bacteria, yeast, and molds, and we have learned from his webinar more about the fermentation process with both science and tradition behind some of our favorite products. So let me mention a few like Laguna's Quesong Puti or white soft cheese, Pangasinan's fermented rice cakes or puto, and even Ilocos region sugarcane wine or basi. Again, you may click on these artifacts and photos to know more about the fermentation process and even the production process of these goods. And aside from these food products, another important part of our culture is our relationship with the environment when it comes to our health and well-being. Dr. Lourdes Cardenas, MNH's curator for medicinal plants, shares with us how the rich history of our fellow Filipinos back then and until now have learned to use various plants as traditional medicine. So the exchanges between the Philippines and other countries, like what happened in Manila Acapulco galleon trade, also led to the introduction of several medicinal plants from the then called Old World and New World to the Philippine soils. And these are now part of our list of herbal cure. Moving forward, from plants, let us dive into the ocean and learn more about the history of these resilient animals. So as you can see, corals grow in different shapes, sizes, and forms, some looking like plates or branches or fingers or even like a human brain. And over time, they can also form different kinds of reefs surrounding islands or forming barriers, but altogether, they house hundreds and thousands of fish, sea turtles, crabs, and other marine animals, just like how our tropical rainforest is also home to a lot of organisms. And Dr. Victor Tixon, MNH's curator for corals, also shares with us how the growth and structural complexity and diversity of these coral reefs benefit the biomass of the entire coral reef system and even the structure and diversity of the fish community. And although corals are translucent, the zooxanthellae or photosynthetic algae living in their tissues also help them to appear beautifully, from brown to green to purple and even orange. And it is actually a symbiotic relationship. The corals protect the algae and give off carbon dioxide and water for its photosynthesis, and the algae then produce oxygen, help corals remove waste, and supply with nutrients from its photosynthesis. And according to MNH's curator for algae and diatoms, Professor Emeritus Milagrosa Martinez Boss, in her webinar on the early records of algae in the Philippines, the first observed algae were those found along the coastlines of the Philippines, like Manila in Luzon, Cebu in Visayas, and Jolo in Mindanao. You may also spot here in this section some seaweeds that are already part of our diet for food and are also commercially available. And from the coastlines, we can now learn more about the animals that can be found in the salt water, fresh water, and land. And these are slugs and snails. So in this section, up to what you can see on that other end, we will be talking or seeing artifacts from the Spanish colonial period. So according to Dr. Emmanuel Ryan de Chavez, MNH's curator for mollusks, the Philippines is one of the world centers for molluscofaunal diversity. And we are actually home to 1/3 of the world's snail species, and around 2 to 4% of these are endemic. And here you can see how our ancestors and the indigenous groups incorporated mollusks as in their lives as part of their diet, survival, livelihood, practices, and tradition. Continuing with the Spanish period, MNH's curator for herpetofauna, Dr. Leticia Afuang, along with her team, also gave us a recall of herpetofaunal studies in the Philippines based on their collection of almost 2,000 references. And although the earliest historical accounts only briefly mention or illustrate reptiles and amphibians like snakes and crocodiles, we will be seeing later the growth in the documentation, collection, and research in these specific features. Here you can also see, for one, accounts that Dr. Jose Rizal, our very own national hero, also had his collection and even sent them to foreign museums for the identification and description of plants, insects, and animals that can be found here in the Philippines. Still in the Spanish period or Spanish colonial period, Dr. Juan Carlos Gonzalez, MNH's curator for birds, and Mr. Christian Perez, member and records committee of the Wild World Club of the Philippines, presented the contributions of early explorers, collectors, museum expeditions, and ornithologists during the early Spanish colonial period. Some of these include the first birds documented by Antonio Pigafetta, the first illustrated bird list by Spanish historians and Jesuit missionaries, the Malaspina expedition that was the first to collect bird specimens, and French publishers who have described and illustrated Philippine birds, and even Filipino artists who have provided somewhat detailed illustration of Philippine birds while they are also depicting the way of life in the Philippines. Now, from one winged creature to another, MNH's curator for scale insects and other terrestrial arthropods, Dr. Ireneo Lit Jr., and University Research Associate Jeremy Carlo Naredo showed us early written records of the insects found in the Philippines, and also the introduction and attempts of insect-based industries like silkworms, scale insects, and even some accounts that honeybees have been introduced to the Philippines. And also the cultural influences like our folk songs, local terms and words for insects, practices, even food and beliefs that are associated with insects. For one, you may have heard of barang, a form of witchcraft, where the witch is said to command insects and other arthropods to inflict pain, disease, or other lingering harm to an offender. And of course, the presence of black or brown butterflies that signify a visiting soul of our departed relative, loved one, or friend. In this section, Professor Philip Alviola, MNH's curator for small mammals and other wildlife, and Professor Judilyn D. Malibot, MNH's curator for tissues and other small mammals, shows us several observations, records, discoveries, and explorations of mammals, as well as the descriptions and documentations like for bats, pigs, tarsiers, and other mammals found in the Philippines. So for instance, here you can see the crown flying fox or golden crown flying fox and the giant flying fox, both found in the Philippines, where they suggest that this could be the creature specified from the anecdote of Antonio Pigafetta. And continuing from that section, Professor Philip Albiola also describes that era as the period of great mammalian discovery, since there were at least 81 species, or less than half of the current 214 species of Philippine mammal fauna that were known or described. And the personalities you can see here, he also describes as dynamic duos like Hugh Cumming and George Waterhouse, who described at least 25 species. And from the Spanish colonial period, we now move to the events and records during the American colonial period. For mollusks, there are important expeditions and personalities, like the Albatross expedition, Paul Barge, who has described 4 new land snails, and even the introduction of other snails species that later on became one of the most invasive species in the world. You can also see here the photos illustrating or showing the growth of shellfish industry and aquaculture, such as oyster farming that started in Negros Occidental in the 1930s, and mussel farming, where mussels that were once considered as pests also became part of the Filipino diet when mussel farming started in 1955 in Cavite. We also have here prominent Filipino personalities. For one, national scientist Edgardo Gomez, who initiated giant clam spawning and who published a manual for culturing giant clams. And even the trends in malacological research, references, and the future directions for Philippine malacology, like the development of biomimicry technology or constructing buildings and structures by taking inspiration from mollusks, modernization of malacological collections, and the current use of mollusks for cosmeceuticals. For herpetofaunal studies, we can see here the growth of scientific data and studies, and some of these were housed in the Bureau of Science in Manila, as shown here, and also prominent personalities like Edward Harrison Taylor, who had extensive studies on Philippine herpetofauna and remains today as references for studying the distribution and ecological implications of presence and absence of herpetofaunal species. According to Dr. Akwang, herpetofauna are one of the best indicators of the status of ecological environment. You can also see here Dr. Angel Alcala, the father of Philippine Herpetological Studies, who has spent over 30 years leading studies in herpetology, and the next generation following him is in the name of Dr. Walter Brown and Dr. Arvin Diaz-Moss and Dr. Rafe Brown, who are also highly productive herpetological researchers. And Dr. Afwang, during her webinar, also echoed the call for more people to venture in herpetology, although it comes with the need to overcome challenges like expedition or studies during the nighttime, and of course, the fear of handling snakes, lizards, and other herpetofaunal species. For the field of herpetology, many species of birds were also described during the American period, the Japanese colonial period, and even until the post-war Philippines. After the 40 years worth of collection of representative species at the Bureau of Science were destroyed in the Battle of Manila in 1945, we have seen that there has been a lot of action to reestablish the collections. And here you can see, for one, Dioscoro Rabor, regarded as the father of Philippine wildlife conservation, who gave us the book Philippine Birds and Mammals, and also a paper on birds of Cebu to raise awareness for conservation, and the campaign to alert the world to the endangered status of the Philippine eagle. In the new millennia, Dr. Gonzalez also featured the first official field guide to the birds of the Philippines, which was published in 2000, describing it as a catalyst for bird surveys and bird watching, since the major references includes 572 species of birds. Dr. Gonzalez also mentions the need to fill data gaps such as in genetics, video documentations of birds in the fields, their calls and bioacoustics, nest and egg documentation, local names documentation, and even forensics, since these will all help us to evaluate the status of our bird species and to take actions to conserve them better. And last, but definitely not the least, here in this section, we can see highlights from Professor Annalie Hadsal and Ma'am Michelle San Pascual's webinar, where they highlighted the history and development of the Philippine educational system and the legacy of Father Francisco Blanco in the field of botany. In his book, The Flora de Filipinas, that had 3 issues published in the 1837, 1845, and 1877 up to 1883, it showed colored illustrations, Latin binomials, and even the native or local names of several plant species found in the Philippines. In 2017, there was actually a fifth edition that was published to include the updated names of these species and to include the precise botanical description and even the different uses of these plants. On the other hand, here you can see some of the highlights from Miss Michelle San Pascual's talk, where she shared with us a lot of stories behind the Spanish names of Philippine botanical species, and even some of the folk tales featuring these plants. Some of these, as you can see here, let me move. So here you can see the kamachile, or which was considered a popular snack before. Kalachuchi, used as a calachuchi used as a decoration for patron saints during the Holy Week. The San Pedro or chichirica that has medicinal properties, and even other species like the botoncillo that is named as such because it resembles buttons. The fragrant ilang-ilang, which were used in the past in making sampaguita garlands. The cadena de amor, which was also featured before in a 1934 festival in UP to symbolize the continuous flow of ideas and ideals of UP to the students, all designed for the service of country, mankind, and God. And of course, here you can see piña that is featured in our folklores or alamat that is being passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation. Ms. San Pascual also reminds us that since some of the Spanish names may be similar or the same, we can choose to refer instead on their species name or scientific name so that we can search them accurately. And here you can find a section about the Museum of Natural History. So while looking back at the events that have unfolded and made the Philippines what it is today, we must all continue to go forward with pride and hope as the Filipino has historically done to stand up on its own so that we can ensure that the Philippine biodiversity and environment will be preserved and conserved, and it will not end up just as facts or photos that we can see in our history books and in our virtual exhibit. So that is a short preview of our virtual tour. If you will access the virtual exhibit on the MNH website, you can click on the automated tour and you can also start freely exploring the virtual exhibit on your own pace. Thank you po.
That was an amazing presentation. Okay? Parang inulit talaga yung quincentennial presentation natin. Okay? In the enough time, I think we have to continue on with the next launching exhibit.